Hi, welcome to the Law of Fojo podcast. I am your host, Robert Fojo, and I would like to welcome my guest, Peter Serefine. Peter is a proud U.S. Navy veteran. He has been a Constitutional Convention political talk show host for 2 years. His show is called Liberty Lighthouse. He describes it as a beacon of common sense. We need a lot of that these days, cutting through the fog of politics. He's also written two short books. His most recent publication is titled So Simple Even a Politician Can Understand, and that was published last July 4th, 2021. Peter, thank you for coming on. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Um, your book, I read your book. I like the title. I see what you did there. I think politicians, much like lawyers, tend to complicate things unnecessarily. What inspired you to write the book?
I, well, what inspired me to get into politics in the first place about 4 years ago was just how crazy our society has become. I wrote another book uh, that was my first foyer into politics. It's called Progress, really. Um, the second book, the most recent one, So Simple Even a Politician Can Understand, that was inspired by ideas that I've had after hosting Liberty Lighthouse for the previous years. um, Ideas that have come up in conversations with my guests. Some of them my ideas, some of them their ideas, some of them just kind of organic ideas that popped up during a conversation. So I thought, simple is what we're missing. The U.S. Constitution is roughly 4,500 words. Half of the people that were involved in writing it were attorneys, yet they wrote a document that was 4,500 words that can be read by anybody, read and understood by anybody who's graduated high school.
I didn't know attorneys could write simple documents.
Apparently, they haven't been able to for about 250 years now,
I
but
would
yeah.
agree with that. I would agree with that. Why did you get involved in covering politics in the first place?
The well, the to use the old phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back, the thing that pushed me beyond the edge, that said, "Look, I've got to do something about this," was the abortion laws being pushed in New York and Virginia, removing the second, first or second trimester line, saying that you can only have an abortion up to this point.
Right.
New York and Virginia, both roughly the same time, removed that line, allowing abortions up to the day of birth. And New York literally celebrated it. Like the lawmakers applauded and cheered and everything the day that it passed.
Mm.
And the governor of Virginia, who before becoming governor was a pediatrician, important sidebar there, uh, went on a radio show and said that, in the case of a botched abortion, when a baby comes out alive, well, we'll keep the baby comfortable while we talk to the mother to decide what to do.
That is
And
grotesque.
that's ridiculous, and
Yeah.
that goes completely against his oath as a doctor.
Right.
And it because it was so ridiculous, and people didn't seem to be seeing it as ridiculous as I was. I said, "Well, I have to do something," and I'm a high school educated nobody who, well, I didn't have a big platform. I didn't know what else I could do, so I wrote and self-published the first book, and then started to blog, and then the blogging turned into podcasting, and the podcasting is now a weekly syndicated radio show,
Mhm.
and then our second book and syndicated columns, and a bunch of different stuff.
That's awesome. I think that's great. It seems like you've found a connection with your audience on a lot of these issues. On your website, you also post something every morning. It's called the Liberty Minute. Is that right?
Yes, the Liberty Minute. That is probably the most popular thing I've ever done.
Mm,
It gets thousands of views every day,
mm.
whereas anything else I do, I'm lucky to get a few hundred.
Your most recent one I saw. I think I watched it this morning. It was the your you addressed the Biden administration's or the Secret Service agency's response to a Freedom of Information Act request, in which the request was for visitor logs to President Biden's home in Delaware. He has spent something like 90 some days at his home in Delaware during his presidency thus far. And the Secret Service agency responded to the request by saying that they don't have any such information. What's your view on that?
Well, it was 99 days that I usually refer to him as Resident Biden without the P. Um, but the 99 days in the first year of office that
Mhm.
President Biden spent in Delaware in his two homes in Delaware. Um, with that works out if you do the math, 99 divided by 365, that's 27% of his time in office that first year was spent in Delaware. And the Secret Service says they have no records. Now, imagine that with any other president in history when you have no idea who is meeting with the president. Not to mention, Biden himself has admitted openly that his house guests have influenced his view on politics, have changed his opinion on certain items in
Mhm.
policy. So now we have this undocumented list of people that are visiting with the president of the United States, influencing our policy, and we don't even know who those people are.
Right. I find it terribly implausible that the Secret Service is not maintaining any kind of record of who is visiting President Biden at his home in Delaware, particularly when we know he has hosted foreign officials or foreign business associates in connection with Hunter Biden at his home in the past. We know this now, thanks to the courageous reporting by the New York Post. But we know that he conducts business at his home in Delaware. There's no way he could go 99 days in Delaware without addressing presidential business. So we know that the affairs of our country are being impacted by what he's doing at his home. And I find it completely and utterly implausible that there are no such records.
If there are no such records, it's because they were ordered not to keep them.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, usually the way Freedom of Information Act requests work, and every state has its own FOIA or right to know or public records law in place that allows citizens to request records that are supposed to be available to the public. If the records are available, usually they're supposed to be provided. They are
Right.
subject to some exemptions, but if there are no such records, then the government agency is supposed to respond that there are no such records. So here, if in fact there are no such records, I agree with you. It's likely because they were instructed not to keep them.
It's the only plausible answer.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, they're lying, which, as implausible as that might seem, I don't think that's far fetched in this day and age in politics. But the more likely scenario is, I think you're right. They were likely instructed not to keep them. Um, there is a court decision that is related to all this, and kind of it's what started all this, and that was a 2013 DC Circuit opinion. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it was authored by Merrick Garland, our Attorney General right now, and President Obama's unsuccessful Supreme Court nominee.
Mhm.
But at the time, he was a circuit court judge. The Obama administration was involved in litigation concerning similar requests for similar information. And Merrick Garland concluded in that opinion that visitor logs are fall well under the law. There's a certain test you need to apply to determine whether or not visitor logs fall under the agency records that are supposed to be produced under the law. He concluded that the president's constitutional right to having confidential communications trumped the obligation to produce records under that law. Are you aware of that decision at all?
No, I was not aware of that decision, and I would be okay with that
Right.
if and only if those that keep these records would be willing to admit and classify and separate out state affairs versus personal affairs. I don't need to know every time one of the Biden's friends and family come to visit, but I do need to know when, let's say, they invite Joe Manchin to Delaware to
Right.
have a big fancy state dinner and talk about why he won't support, Bill X, Y, or Z, which
Which
has
happens.
happened, right? So we know that has happened,
Right.
and that is state business. I don't care where on the planet it occurred. It is state business, and state business is subject to FOIA.
I agree. I agree. That opinion was obviously used by the Obama administration to refuse disclosure of various pieces of information. Then the Trump administration used it um, and relied on it to refuse disclosure of similar information. But now Biden, the other thing that smacks me is total hypocrisy here is the Biden administration hailed itself as being more transparent and returning things to and adhering to some level of transparency that apparently did not exist under President Trump, and he's just refusing outright to disclose that uh, the logs for anyone who's visiting his home, when we know that there is state business occurring at his home. I find that is completely and utterly hypocritical.
Absolutely. The self, as I said in the Liberty Minute, it was
Mhm.
yesterday morning. As I said in there, the self-proclaimed most transparent administration ever, but they won't disclose who's even visiting the uh, the president in
Right.
his two Delaware homes.
I also think it's alarming in another sense. We all know that the president is suffering from some kind of cognitive decline, whatever that may be. And I am sure he's being visited at his home by doctors or other healthcare professionals. And we're also being kept in the dark about that. And I think that by and large, we've been kept in the dark about whatever his mental condition is, which is clearly affecting the way he handles himself, the way he interacts with people, the way he handles and conducts press briefings. I think that that just further perpetuates that seriously alarming problem. Do you agree with that?
I agree, and I don't think that I don't hold that against him. I don't
Mhm.
hold the mental decline against him. I
Of
mean,
course not.
he is approaching aging. It will happen to all of us. I mean, I'm 49 and my recall speed slows down at times. It
Mhm.
happens. It is, however, part of the transparency issue when we are, as you say, we're just kept completely in the dark about it.
Right.
There's no record, no acknowledgement that it is a problem, no no record of those doctor visits, which absolutely must be happening. And the president's health, it's long standing. The president's health is of public record. It is uh, important to the rest of us.
I agree. So let me dive into your book a little bit, and I like the way your book is structured. It's it's certainly true to its name. It's a series of of solutions to very common problems, and you list them all individually. You explain what the issue is, and then you suggest a simple solution. And I think that some of these are very enlightening, um, for lack of a better word. But for example, let's talk about the federal income tax, which it has been the subject of much debate over the years. Tax policy is a feature of every single presidential administration, of every single political platform when you have a candidate running for these offices. The federal income tax, a lot of people don't know it has not been around for that long, right? I mean,
1913.
1913, yeah. And we were promised that it would not rise above 1% when it was implemented. And we know that that was um, a pipe dream, obviously. But this notion of having the wealthy pay their fair share, this is not a new argument. This has been around for in every single election cycle and has been pushed by the left generation after generation. Isn't that right?
Right, and it's actually where income tax came from. I also
Mhm.
think it's important to note that income tax had been struck down as unconstitutional by
That's
the
right.
US Supreme Court, I believe 3 times
Yep.
prior to the passage of the 16th Amendment, therefore making it constitutional. Prior to the 16th Amendment, the only way that the federal government could tax us, the people, was through the states, through
Right.
apportionment. If the government needed money, they took that however much money that they needed, they divided it up the amongst the states by population. So
Mhm.
states with more people got a bigger portion of the bill. it was then up to the state how to raise that money to send to the federal government. So,
Right.
for example, some states don't have income tax. Other states don't have sales tax. Different states chose different ways of how to raise that money based on how their state works.
Right. And that
With
makes sense.
with the passage of the 16th Amendment, Woodrow Wilson said that it would never go above 2%.
Right.
It was set mostly for wealthy people. Converting the 1913 dollar to today's dollar, you'd have to make about $75,000 a year in today's money in order to qualify to be one of the chosen few to
Right.
pay income tax. So it really was, the well-to-do people only.
It's unfathomable to think that the federal government could operate back then without a federal income tax.
I think it was brilliant.
I
I
mean,
mean,
I agree it's brilliant, but it's just I can't imagine it's just unfathomable by today's standards, given how huge this federal bureaucracy is to consider how in the world they operated
because it wasn't
without
that
all this
huge.
revenue. Go ahead,
It
I'm sorry.
wasn't that huge.
No, I know.
It wasn't supposed to be that huge. It wasn't designed to be that huge.
Right.
The US Constitution lists, about 30 powers of the federal government, and now we have 440 federal departments and agencies. We
Mhm.
don't need 440 departments and agencies to run 30 powers. The
No, it's incredibly wasteful. It's incredibly, redundant at times.
Yeah. The creation of the federal income tax completely flipped the power structure of the United States. It took all of the money and passes it through the IRS and gives
Mhm.
it to Congress. And then Congress gets to divvy out that money, much of which gets divvied out back to the states and used as leverage, as blackmail to get the states to do what the federal government wants them to do.
Right, and throughout that process, what they've essentially done is added layers to, the funding process. You have it's like you said, it's taken from the states, it's taken from individuals and from the states, given to the IRS, sent to Congress, and then it just kind of streams its way down back to the states, through various conditions and strings attached, funding mechanisms, and so on and so forth. And that process just it seems incredibly wasteful because we've just added 3 or 4 layers to this process, and it seems incredibly redundant as well. It I am not sure how we've let it get this bad. I mean, the tax code itself is 44,000 pages and change, right?
Right.
And it is it's just an absolute mess. You need to hire professionals to be able to read this thing. If you're a business, you're spending hundreds, thousands of dollars just to file a tax return.
Right.
It's the whole thing is just so wasteful. It's so expensive. It's I think it's outlasted. It's whatever its purpose was 100 some years ago. Your solution to resolving the issue of taxes is a fair tax, right?
That's one of the ideas.
It's one of the ideas.
I think it starts with we need to eliminate having a myriad different types of tax. I think the first thing we do is we go to a single form of tax.
Right.
I don't care if it's a consumption-based tax like a sales tax or an income tax or whatever, but to have inheritance tax and capital gains tax and income tax and gasoline tax and 400,000 different versions of tax.
Mhm.
You and I have no idea how much of our money is going to the federal government. There's absolutely no way of calculating it
Mhm.
because of the layers and layers and layers of let's just use corporate income tax as an example. If you go to the local grocery store and buy an apple, how many different people have owned that apple from the time that it came off of a tree?
Oh
You know,
god.
you've got the farmer, the distributors, the warehousers, the grocery retailer. Every one of those people has to pay tax on that apple.
Mhm.
The cost of that tax, obviously, is going to be added back into the cost of that apple.
Mhm.
So we have no idea of knowing how much when we go to the store and we let's say we buy an apple for $1, how much of that dollar is going to the federal coffers? No idea at all. No way of calculating that. So idea number one in as far as tax goes is to go to a simple one type of tax.
Mhm.
Whether it's an income-based tax or whether it's a corporate tax or whether it's a real estate tax, I don't care. Just pick one so that we know how much we're paying.
I think it would likely be as much as you and I would love for that development to occur. I think it's likely impossible to get there because there are so many different interests involved.
Right. Exactly.
Every one of these industries has a lobbying arm that's going to sway that kind of decision. It seems like that's a pipe dream. I recognize and I agree with you that that's a great way to approach it. Let's just pick one tax so that everybody knows what's being charged and how and where, and then they can then govern their behavior that way. It's transparent, it's simple, it's easy, it's likely going to be a lot cheaper.
Right.
But I find that you know that solution is too cute by half. It would be impossible for all of these politicians to come together and make a decision like that.
Right. Now, the fair tax that you mentioned, that's
Yeah.
one of the ideas that exists for how to make one simple form of tax.
Right.
Fair tax is not my idea. It's an organization that's already out there.
Hmm.
It is a bill that has been presented in Congress and represented every year for decades now, and it never goes anywhere because of that, because it is so simple,
Hmm.
because it eliminates much potential for corruption, because it eliminates the influence of these special interest groups. Fair tax is a sales tax, a
Hmm.
federal sales tax that replaces all other forms of federal tax.
Right.
And the math that was done, the multi-million dollar study that was done said that that sales tax would have to be 22% in order to keep government functioning at the level that it's functioning now.
It's pretty high.
It sounds pretty high.
Yeah.
But if you eliminate those 45 layers of corporate tax in everything you buy
Hmm.
and replace it with a 22% tax, according to their multi-million dollar study, the net effect on your wallet is zero.
Interesting.
It's supposed to be just, everybody has the same amount of money. One
Right.
of the immediate arguments that people have is, well, a sales tax is unfair to the poor.
Yeah.
Well, the Fair Tax Organization even has an idea for that. They take the poverty line and they refund the sales tax for anybody and everybody based on the poverty line. So I don't know, let's just say $1,000. Let's say that after they do their fancy math, they say that the average person at poverty level spends $1,000 a month in tax. They take that $1,000 a month and they give it back to everybody, not
Mhm.
just the poor, not just the rich, not the middle class, everybody. No discrimination. Everybody gets the same tax breaks and incentives. All loopholes go away. All carve outs for special industries go away. All kickbacks go away. It is what it is. It is a flat sales tax across all new and only new goods and services. What I like most about the idea of going to a consumption-based tax like the fair tax is that it allows you and I to have at least a little bit of control on how much money we give our federal government. You want to run out and buy a $300,000, Lamborghini?
Mhm.
Fine, whatever. You're going to pay your 22% tax on your $300,000 car. You don't want to pay that tax? Don't buy that car. Buy something cheaper.
Right.
Don't want to pay tax at all? Buy a used car.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It returns some of the decision making to the individual, because I find that a lot of these policies pushed by the federal government, for the most part, often rob us of our ability to govern ourselves. It's as if the government doesn't believe that we can make the right choices for ourselves,
Right.
and I've always found that to be very insulting.
Well, like Ronald Reagan said, allowing the intellectual elite in a far distant capital make our decisions. It,
Exactly. Um, This solution, this would be solely for the federal government, right?
Right.
Which states would obviously retain based on your views, states would be able to retain the ability to determine how
How they're going to
they
do
should levy taxes to fund their state level services. Local governments can decide how to fund schools, whether through property taxes or what have you. That's obviously a separate issue.
right.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a very interesting solution. There have been candidates, presidential candidates, who have pushed the idea. I think the most recent one was, well, he bundled it with other ones. It was Herman Cain, 12, 14 years ago. I think he was his 999 plan included a 9% sales tax. Am I right? Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
I, that was
Not
part of
paying
his.
any attention.
That was part of his plan. He was a Republican candidate at the time. That was the year that Mitt Romney ended up with the nomination. It was in 2012. That's right. And Herman Cain came out with, he called it the 999 plan, and I think it was a 9% federal income tax, a 9% sales tax, and I want to say there's a 9% corporate tax, but I may be wrong. But he was pushing this 9% sales tax, which, in theory, it sounded great, but I feel like at times some of these politicians, the infighting is just so infuriating. They had a debate in New Hampshire, a primary debate, and one of the other Republican candidates was Rick Santorum, and he attacked Herman Cain's 999 plan, and then motioned out to the audience and said, "Do you all New Hampshire does not have a sales tax or an income tax?" And
Wow.
he asked, "Do you all want a sales tax? You don't have a sales tax in New Hampshire. Do you want a 9% federal sales tax now?" And the crowd boos and agrees with Santorum, but it was an interesting and innovative idea. Why don't we talk about it instead of just shooting it down? And Republicans are guilty of it. Unfortunately, they reject simple solutions.
Everybody
Um,
in Washington.
yeah, I'm sorry. Say
Well,
it again.
I said everybody in Washington rejects
Yeah,
the simple solutions. That's why I wrote this book and why I called it so simple, even a politician can understand.
right,
And a listener of my show, Liberty Lighthouse, sent copies of my book to Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, like all of the Washington D.C. leadership, and I thought that was great. Um, the chances of any of them reading it are next to none.
right.
But hopefully, at least one of them has a staffer look at it, and
Yeah,
we're not as stupid as they think we are.
I agree. The contempt that some of these politicians often have for the general public. They think we're dumb. They think if they package something in a certain way that we're not going to truly understand it. But people like you, people like me, I think what we've seen over the last 2 years, especially with all the COVID restrictions that were implemented, people are a lot smarter than these government officials uh, make them out to be.
Absolutely, and people are starting to wake up to one of the points that I've been trying to hammer through in the last couple of years, and I think people are starting to get it, not because I'm the one talking about it. I think people are
Mhm.
realizing it for themselves. Only 4% of our elected officials are at the federal level. 96% are state, county, and local elected jobs.
Mhm.
It truly is the intellectual elite class that is in
Right.
Washington. But if we really honestly understand and take control of the state, local, and county jobs, our federal government really doesn't have any power at all. All they have is the power of the purse.
Mhm.
And if you don't like what the federal Department of Education is doing, just as an example, make sure that the people on your school board are willing to stand up and say, "Well, we don't need your money then because we're not doing that."
I think that's a great point. What I have noticed is over the last 2 years, many of these people have understood that a lot of the damage that occurred from businesses being shut down, schools being closed, all the mandates, and so on and so forth, all of that damage was done at the state and local level.
Right?
And people simply stopped paying attention. Everyone pays attention to the federal election cycle every 4 years. Perhaps half of those people pay attention to the midterm election cycle, like the one this year. But they can't name any of their state senators, state representatives. Sometimes they don't even know who the governor is. They don't even know who's on their school board. And they started paying attention and realizing, holy shit, what are these people doing? What are these people on our school board doing? What are they teaching our children? What is our board of aldermen doing? And now what I've started to see is people get involved in running for school board, people getting involved in local government, and they're starting to wake up. And that's what I told a lot of clients when they were coming to me with, my school has a mask mandate. What do we do? And we take a shot at it. If it's unsuccessful, and then they ask me, what do we do now? And my response was always, you need to pay attention. You need to get involved. Go to your school board meeting. Understand who is in charge and who is implementing these policies, and vote them out of there.
Right. I've said for years now, I believe that the county sheriff is the most important elected job in our country. If Washington goes completely off the rails and wants to do something unconstitutional, you need to have law enforcement that is willing to say, no, we're not doing that. The federal government does not have the manpower, let's say, to walk door to door and take guns. If the federal government tomorrow decided that guns were illegal, we didn't need them as private citizens, it would be the county sheriffs that would have to be the ones collecting them.
Right.
So you need to make sure that your county sheriff is going to say, no, I'm not doing that. That's
Mhm.
unconstitutional.
And we saw that happen over the last year. We saw county sheriffs, heads of police departments, declare that they weren't going to enforce, you know, whatever policy of the week was being handed down in
What an
in your
unconstitutional
blue
mandate.
state. I think it was in New York. The governor announced a new statewide mask mandate last fall, and I don't know how many police department chiefs and county sheriffs came together and said, "We're not going to enforce this. This is ridiculous."
Well, the problem is, in most states, the structure is such that if a police department chief stands up and says, "I'm not gonna do that," then the mayor or somebody has the power to just fire that chief and hire another one. You
Right.
can't do that with a sheriff. A sheriff
Interesting.
is elected,
Yep, that's true. That's actually very true.
and the only people that can and the only way he can get fired is if he actually commits a crime. And here in my home state of Pennsylvania, it would then take 2 constables, which are also elected law enforcement, to
Right.
remove that sheriff from office.
You're a constable yourself, right?
I just recently became a constable, yes.
And is that why you became a constable, because of what you're describing?
No, actually, I became a constable because in the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a constable is the only law enforcement allowed at the polling stations on election day.
I see.
And our elections have gotten a little ugly, and I suspect that they're gonna get even uglier. So I thought that law enforcement at polling stations was a good idea. And
Yeah,
when our last municipal election did not elect a constable, I looked at how to get appointed to that position because I did not want it to be vacant.
interesting. Let me segue into another one of the issues that you address in your book, and this is one that a lot of people don't know a lot about. It's also somewhat of a niche, if you will, in the law. Uh, I'm an attorney, obviously, and I've been 17 years in practice, but I did spend a good amount of time litigating what's called public bidding or competitive bidding disputes. And so, just by way of background for the audience, when you have two private parties entered into a contract, let's say you hire a contractor to build an improvement on your house, you have complete freedom to choose whoever you want and agree on a price and then move forward with the project. When the government does that, when the government hires any kind of vendor, a contractor, or anyone to provide a certain service, and usually when it's above a certain amount of money, there is at the state level a law, or at the federal level a set of laws that imposes a certain set of requirements
Mhm.
for that relationship. And essentially what it boils down to is the government has to engage in a fair and competitive and open bidding process. It has to solicit bids from contractors or vendors who are interested in providing the service, and it has to conduct an evaluation process that's fair and open and transparent, and it can't employ any kind of bias or prejudice in favor of one bidder over another, and it has to select the bidder based on a certain set of criteria. Um, your book, you address this issue, and you posit that the government at times isn't following these requirements in a variety of capacities.
Right. There there are very few exceptions to that rule,
Hmm.
the fair bidding process. One of those exceptions that is completely overused is the idea that, there is only one company that does X, Y, or Z.
Right.
So, if you're looking for somebody to do X and there's only one company that does X, well, what's the point of a fair bidding process? So, there is an exception for that. However, using a logical mind, how do you know that there's only one company that does X
Right.
unless you put out a bid, unless you put out a request for services? And I list one example in the book
Mm.
of a contract from the DoD, the Department, or I'm sorry, yeah, it was DoD, Department of Defense.
Hmm.
One example where they wanted a device that could explode roadside bombs safely, and they found somebody was awarded a contract, and the device that basically shot lightning at the roadside bombs blew them up from a safe distance. And the company that was awarded the contract was awarded it without a bidding process because supposedly they were the only ones that did it. Lo and behold, no, they weren't. There was another company that
There has to
developed,
be.
yeah,
Yeah.
there was another company that had developed an almost identical product
Hmm.
that cost significantly less, but they weren't given the contract because it did not go through the fair bidding process. Would have saved the would I think I said in the book how much, I don't remember now, but it would have saved taxpayers a lot of money
Yeah.
had the Department of Defense done that.
I think whether it's the government abusing an exception like that or neglecting to follow the requirements that apply, I think that tends to happen a lot more at the state and local level.
I would
Um,
agree.
yeah, and because I've seen it happen a lot in cases I've been involved with. For example, recently I represented a company that provides telehealth services, and they bid on it was a 3-year contract. I mean, the value of the contract over time would have been 9 to $12 million or something like that, and it
Okay.
was put out by a county in New Hampshire for services at they were looking for a provider to manage and provide healthcare services for a nursing home. And there was one physician from Massachusetts that they had always awarded this contract to. It was 3 times now. So this guy's been handling the services there for at that facility for something like a decade. And they solicited bids. They got 2 other bidders. One of the additional 2 bidders was my client, but then they awarded it to the incumbent provider, who provided a one-page proposal. There was a requirement in the state statute that they submit all of these bids to what's called an executive committee. They didn't do that. Um, they knocked my client for some other uh, features of its proposal that it had no authority to do under the statute. And my client decided they wanted to sue, and we did. But what was surprising to me was when we identified the county's failure to submit the bids to an executive committee. The county admitted that they didn't do that. They did not follow that requirement, and their rationale was, "Well, we just don't do that. We simply don't do that." Well, it's a requirement in the law. You're supposed to do it, because my client's bid was significantly less expensive than the one that they accepted, by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's I find that happens a lot more often at the local level, where again people are not paying attention, running with that theme.
Oh, I'm absolutely sure. Hey, the school needs a new air conditioning system. Well, we used Billy Bob last time. Let's
Right.
just hire him again.
Yeah.
Uh, and part of it is convenience, I'm sure. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it is entirely done for corrupt purposes. It's not, the school board hiring their nephews or something like that. I'm sure there's plenty of that as well, but I don't believe it is always that. I really believe that a lot of it is just convenience. Like you said,
Sure.
you got the incumbent guy. He already knows how the system works.
Mhm.
He's here. He's done it. He knows us. He knows how we operate. There's value to that. And maybe that should be part of the bidding process. Maybe there is value and that is weighted in the bidding process. but there's a bidding process, and you have to
Yeah.
follow the bidding process.
Yeah, I think what you touched on an interesting issue, and it's one that I always try to explain and express to people, and that is that it's an issue of convenience. It's not necessarily there isn't necessarily a nefarious motive behind the failure to follow a competitive bidding requirement or some other applicable law. It's convenience, it's mistake, it's ignorance. Government officials are human beings just like all of us.
Right.
They are not somehow endowed with superior knowledge, superior experience, and it's some level of infallibility. They are humans just like us. They make mistakes, and I feel that the general public at times places a lot of importance on the ability of a government official to do the right thing when they are just as fallible as we are, and just as likely to and just as susceptible to making mistakes as we are, and that's something that, can be alleviated by imposing a set of requirements like competitive bidding standards, um, but even then, at times, that does not provide sufficient protection, but I feel that we need to do a better job of recognizing the government officials are humans like all of us and are just as fallible.
Well, not to mention, there are so many laws in our country that there's no way possible to know them all. I mean,
Right.
you couldn't there's not a way in the world to know all of the federal laws alone.
Yeah.
There are so many of them that it is not possible to calculate. In fact, I think it was about 2020-ish, a report came out, a company that had, one of those sunshine kind of companies that wants to, transparency in government stuff. They had been trying for years, for I want to say 2 years, to count the number of federal laws, and they gave up.
Yeah. It is voluminous. In my legal practice, when there are times when someone asks me a question and I know the answer off the top of my head. There are other times when someone asks me a question, a legal question, and my answer is, I don't know. I need to look it up.
There are
I
probably
don't
times when they ask you a question where you not only don't know, you don't even know where to start looking.
No, I go you know what I do? I go to Google. That's how I start searching. So I start researching it because inevitably you'll find articles that address the issue. You'll find some case law that addresses the issue, and that's the starting point for me. It's a starting point for many lawyers. Surprisingly, some people think that we're just encyclopedias of knowledge. We're not. We start at the same place you do, but you're absolutely right. It is impossible for a human being in a government position to know all of the possible requirements that apply to his or her decision making and his or her conduct, and they suffer from the same limitations that we do.
Yeah. There was a book a while back that I think it's just titled something simple like Six Felonies. There's a
Mhm.
theory out there that there are so many laws that you and I, just walking down the street every day, commit 6 or 7 felonies without even knowing it. Just
I
because
believe
there's
it.
yeah, ridiculous laws.
I believe it. Everything from, God knows how many times I've jaywalked. I'm sure
Right.
I'm a repeat offender in that department. Um, let's so, before we move on, so your solution to the government bidding to the competitive bidding problem is governments need to enforce the laws. Is
Yeah,
that
like,
it?
actually just follow the law
Just
that's
follow the
already
freaking
there.
laws, yeah.
Yeah.
That's it's the same thing with immigration. I mean, I won't dive into that animal, but
Agreed.
if if we just followed if the government just enforced competitive bidding requirements, we would eliminate a lot of waste.
And save a bunch of money.
Yeah. I find that sometimes the best way the best enforcement mechanism that I've seen when it comes to that is, unfortunately, lawyers representing losing bidders filing lawsuits, and that essentially operates as its own form of tort reform, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. Um, let
But
me
if they get beat over
go
the
ahead.
head by lawyers enough
I'm sorry?
if they get beat over the head by lawyers enough,
Yeah.
maybe they'll start to do it right. That's unfortunately
It has I mean, there are a lot of research has been done on the topic in the medical malpractice personal injury arena, that lawyers filing lawsuits on behalf of, injured plaintiffs have essentially and effectively reformed the industry. I don't I don't know anything beyond that. I haven't delved into that kind of research, but I can see the rationale for that, and I that's why I mentioned, in the competitive bidding area, lawyers filing lawsuits on behalf of losing bidders is one way to force the government to enforce these provisions, or force local and state government institutions to follow the procedures they need to follow.
Right, but the one problem with that though is, let's say the town council, you sue the town council because they didn't follow the bidding procedures. The
Yeah.
judge or whomever awards some type of a settlement for the guy who lost. Well, that's your tax money again. That's
Yeah.
you sue the government, it's your money. Like,
Yeah, that's one argument, that's one counter argument that's often launched by the government institution in
but have they
response to
thought?
such a lawsuit, is that you're forcing us now to spend that's very taxpayer dollars that you wanted to be saved. You're wanting us to spend that now on litigation to defend a claim that we didn't follow the law. I mean, I recognize that, but it's an impossible situation, because otherwise there's no other enforcement mechanism. There's no other way to call attention to the violation.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's one of those. It's kind of like government itself. It's a necessary evil. It's the only way it can be done.
Yeah. Um, One other issue I wanted to touch on from your book is the budgeting issue. And you write in your book, and these numbers just jumped out at me off the page, and I just couldn't believe it when I read it. And I knew this already, but I don't really focus on it too much because it's just ridiculous. So you wrote that the Congressional Budget Office reports the U.S. federal budget now tops $4 trillion annually. And then you kind of broke this down. That means that our federal government spends $11 billion per day. To put that in perspective, if you spend $1 million a day, every day, it would take you just shy of 11,000 years to spend $4 trillion. And then if you spend $1 billion a day, it would take you 4,000 years to spend $4 trillion. This is a disaster.
Right.
I mean,
And oh, by the way, that's outdated already.
yeah, I know, because God knows this was as of last year.
Right. And Biden's proposal for next year is $5.8 trillion.
I mean, does the government even have a budget?
No, they have not passed a complete budget. Okay, now look, if you look up the definition of a
Right,
budget is a comparison of both expenses and incomes at the same time.
right,
Our government hasn't done that in like 25 years. We our president puts forth a tax proposal, a tax bill. Um, the House and Senate, a tax bill gets passed,
mhm,
and at some point, then a continuing resolution spending bill gets passed. They don't even pass new spending bills.
right.
They do continuing resolutions with amendments to them, which is basically saying, let's just keep spending the same crap we spent last year plus this stuff.
I
It's
mean,
ridiculous. It is,
it's astounding.
and it's unconstitutional. It
I
needs to
agree.
be a budget.
Yeah, in every business, well, most businesses that are well run have budgets. Individuals have budgets. I mean, I try not to spend more than what I earn. If I have $10 in my pocket and I walk into a candy store, I'm only going to buy $10 worth or less of candy. It's inconceivable to me, and I think few people focus on this, that the government essentially spending more money than it takes in
Yeah,
every year.
here's another funny thing that I don't think I addressed this in the book. Our government has convinced us that welfare and Medicare and Medicaid and all of the social programs are mandatory spending.
Right.
However, the Department of Defense budget is discretionary spending. Which of those is in the Constitution as something that our federal government is required to do? National defense.
Yeah.
So that's the mandatory spending.
Right.
Everything in the social programs is discretionary, but we have been convinced that it's mandatory because they pass laws that says we're going to do this for another 20 years. So
Right.
it's mandatory for the next 20 years. Almost 3/4 of what our federal government spends is on those social programs.
Yeah.
If we don't have reform to the social programs and in some way or another, it's going to destroy our country. We will end up being the welfare state that oh, I forget which communist dictator said that they were going to use the welfare state to destroy us, but they're going to get their way.
Yeah. How do we I mean, where do you start with trying to reform those services?
I, well, my thing is limits.
Yeah.
Um, Anybody who is not 100% permanently disabled, because
Mhm.
those people in most Americans believe that if you are completely and totally 100% disabled, then yes, the government should take care of you. You are unable to take care of yourself.
Right.
Everybody who is below that line in any way, shape, or form should have some type of a limit on what they can or cannot get.
Right.
And the fact that we have, I forget, 40 different departments and agencies that are all in some way trying to help people that need help,
Mhm.
I seriously doubt that those 40 or so departments and agencies interact and communicate and know
I highly doubt that.
who's giving what to whom. So
Right.
we need to look at all of this social spending on a holistic basis. Stop looking at just Medicare or just SNAP or just welfare or just whatever, and look at everything that is available to a household or a person
Yeah.
and put a limit on it. And in nobody in no circumstance ever should be able to collect more than the federal poverty line. Period.
Yeah, you proposed something like that, on the welfare issue in your book, and that was that the concept, the revolutionary concept, it seems, that welfare should be temporary, that the system we have apparently makes it too comfortable, and it does not incentivize people to get out of that.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm twice divorced. And at one point, my first ex-wife was told by her social worker, somebody who was helping her through the process, to not get a job because she would lose benefits.
Yeah.
That's the exact opposite of what the system is for. Everything about social programs should be focused on making the individual self-sufficient again in the shortest amount of time possible. If that
Right.
means that they have to go to school, get an education, go to VOTEC, whatever, then that's where the focus should be.
Right.
And that support should be temporary. It should be tied to the federal poverty line so that we can stop arguing about who gets how much. This is the cap. You want to as the poverty line goes up and down with the economy, so do benefits. And it should be tapered after, I don't know, after a year, it drops by 25% and it drops by
You're being
25%
generous.
every year after that. Yeah. Like
That seems
something like
generous. I we saw a lot of this last year or the last couple of years when people who were forced to stay home, particularly in the restaurant and hospitality industry.
Mhm.
When those businesses reopened, they found it so difficult to find people to work because people were essentially sitting home and collecting more money in unemployment and other benefits than they would have made going to work. And obviously, if they go to work, then they forego those benefits. That was such a perverse incentive that
Well, even if they weren't making as much, I'm gonna tell you right now, you give me about half of what I make at my job, I'm probably willing to stay home and sit and do nothing. If you're just gonna
yeah.
give me half the money, I don't need to make as much money as I make at work if
Mhm.
I'm just sitting around doing nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. But what strikes me though is sometimes some of these numbers. I mean, there are people sitting at home and collecting $600-700 a month, and they find a way to live on that,
Yeah,
and that's sufficient for them. And I could never. I mean, obviously, I couldn't do that. Period. I have a family to feed, but I where is the where is the motivation in society? Where is the incentive to better yourself to have I like nice things. Some people like nice things. They like to make money so that they can go on vacation, buy the nice car. Where is that incentive in some of these people? They're perfectly fine sitting at home collecting a few $100s a month from some government service, and they're content with that. I'll never understand that.
I don't know. Um, there are some people that their utility bills are paid for by some utility agency. Their mortgage or rent or whatever is paid for by some other housing agency, and yeah, they get a little bit of food stamps and a little bit of cash benefits, and well, they're good. Hey, I got a roof, I got
Right.
utilities, I got enough money to eat, and that's all I need.
That's amazing. Um, Final topic.
Okay,
Let me see here which one I want to choose because I took a lot of notes after I read your book.
it's a shame.
Um, there was an issue. You addressed fake news in your book. I found that interesting, and I kind of saw this come to fruition to some extent earlier this week. You wrote about the fact that when you watch the news, a lot of the narratives that are conveyed to us, it seems like most of them are coordinated to some extent. Can you explain that a little bit?
Uh, I don't know if it's just laziness on the part of reporters, but I mean, because of what I do, my show Liberty Lighthouse and my daily Liberty Minute thing, I have like four different four different apps on my phone for news,
Right.
and at least one of them is an aggregator where it
Mhm.
goes out and it pulls the headlines in from other websites, and it is not uncommon for me to see exactly the same headline from
Right.
8 different sources. I don't know if that's just laziness on the part of the individual reporting agencies, or is that just because Reuters and the Associated Press send stuff out and everybody just runs with it? I don't know, but we the people have well we I often call Americans fat and lazy, and what I mean by that is that we have just become complacent.
Right.
We don't pay attention to our government anymore. We don't want to go research and look at news from two, three, four different stories with different perspectives.
Mhm.
We're just lazy. Fake news has existed for as long as mankind. If you
Yeah.
look back at the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks, they all, exaggerated their victories and downplayed their failures. And, you know, king, you know, uh, one pharaoh comes to being and tries to erase the memory of the previous pharaoh, and destroys all the monuments and everything in their person's name. This has gone on from the beginning of time.
Right.
um, Lincoln famously fought against just outright lies in the press. It just it happens.
It happens. Yeah, I saw one of the well, not one of the most glaring. I was gonna say one of the most glaring examples, but it's just yet another example of what you're talking about, what you're alluding to. Earlier this week, when the court decision came in from Florida, the federal court decision that overturned the CDC's mask mandate on airplanes and other public travel, the judge who authored the opinion, Judge Mizell, was obviously the she enjoyed the brunt of the focus of many of these news outlets, and the headlines and the focuses of these stories were essentially split into two buckets. And this is what I saw
Mhm.
consistently. And I did a Google search just to see, and I talked about this on my last podcast episode, but essentially they boil down to two messages. She's not qualified. The ABA rated her not qualified when she was nominated by Trump
Uh-huh.
for the court for her judicial seat. Or the headline was "What You Need to Know About Judge Mizell."
How about what you need to know about the United States Constitution?
Imagine if there were stories like that. But those were the two buckets of news stories concerning this judge, and it was kind of. I thought about the same things that you're thinking about. Is this just laziness, or is this some coordinated? I'm not a conspiracy nut by any means, but if it's not laziness, it's are they getting together and just saying, this is what we're going to write about, this is what we're going to focus, this is the narrative we're trying to convey? I mean, are they doing that? Because I can't understand how professional journalists can be that lazy when it comes to conveying information to the public.
Well, they obviously have become that way, and I don't know why.
Right.
Again, like you were just both just said, I don't know if it's laziness or if it's malicious, but like, the protections that I'm sorry, that reporters, the protections of media outlets that they have been taken way too far. They're allowed to say, you know, pretty much anything they want without being
Right.
sued anymore. And it's we're starting to see that come around too. You got, Nick Sandman, who has successfully sued several of the big news agencies for the lies printed about him. Uh,
Hmm.
I suspect that Kyle Rittenhouse will be able to successfully sue several of the news agencies because of the lies printed about him, both
Right.
before and after trial.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The
And he should.
I use the example murder. Murder is a legally definable term. After he was acquitted of murder,
Hmm.
calling him a murderer
Right.
is slander or libel, depending on how you do it.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And many, many, many of the news people did. So,
Yeah, it's in calling someone a murderer, particularly when they've been acquitted of murder. That is that falls into a specific bucket of defamation claims that some states still recognize. It's called defamation per se, for which you don't even need to prove damages because
right.
the false statement imputes criminal liability to you. And there's certain types of statements like that one for which he doesn't even need to prove that he suffered monetary damages in any way. It's essentially a question that's left up to the jury.
It's such an egregious offense.
Exactly. Exactly. And even when the media is reporting that statement, they can't rely on the fair report privilege either because there's no
Right.
judicial decision
Right. They
that
could have said
that
killer.
conveyed that. Right. There's no
They could have,
privilege.
yeah, they could have said killer. Killer is not a legal definition. Like
Mhm.
did he kill people? Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Was it self-defense? Yes, it was.
Right.
Therefore, it was not murder. And
Right.
had, the news media people, had they called him a killer, he probably would have no recourse.
Yeah.
Once that acquittal came through and they continued to call him a murderer,
Right.
they were pushing a narrative. And un until they get sued enough times, it's kinda like we said earlier about, your local government following the fair bidding process. Until they get sued enough times
Yeah.
and it actually starts to hurt their business, they're just gonna keep pushing their narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and that's an interesting distinction, killer versus murder, and I think I agree with that. But it's reprehensible, and I think the only way, unfortunately, to remedy that is to take legal action. So I certainly hope he does that. So, Peter, where could people find your book, your show? Where would you like to point them to so they know where to find you, listen to your show, read your book, or buy your book?
The easiest thing to do is my homepage. It's liberty-lighthouse.com. You can find all of the places to buy my books there. Um, you can find my Liberty Lighthouse weekly show and the Liberty Minute Daily, eh, uh, snarky news headline review, as well as anything else I write. I occasionally write articles and blog posts and things like that. Everything I do goes to liberty-lighthouse.com.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, and I'd love to have you on in the future. I think there are many other topics we could cover and dive into. So I appreciate you coming on. I think you were very insightful and very helpful in conveying some of these simple solutions that we could all benefit from.
You keep using the word solution. I call them ideas because
Ideas,
they're
yeah,
not necessarily perfect solutions, but they're at least a step in the right direction.
ideas, proposals, concepts. I think I agree. I think that there are many different ways we can describe them, but it's a step in the right direction. Thank you very much.
My